Welcome to Econ Thoughts, the podcast series of the Society for Professional Economists here in the UK. I'm Filippo Gaddo, the host, and today I'm absolutely delighted to have with us as guest Mike Strain. Mike is a director of economic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, but he's also a recognized author and columnist for various international organizations such as Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and a columnist for Project Syndicate, where you can find all of his recent articles as well. So Mike, welcome to the interview today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So a lot of your articles recently have addressed issues that are quite topical for our audience and that we have covered in some of our previous interviews here in the UK, though we're going to look at it today with a bit of a US perspective. And they also feature in discussion with business leaders and policy makers, and particular issues around growth, inequality, productivity. And yes, we probably are gonna have to mention AI as well. So I think he's gonna come for sure. I think we're gonna take a little bit of a step back and we're gonna look at the history in the past of the last 50 years, how we got here. Very recently, Mike, you've authored a book a few years back about the American dream is not dead, and we also published a paper recently on the same topic as well. We all hear a lot about wages are stagnating. The middle class have not had a raise in 50 years. We see various charts and memes on X, formerly Twitter, about income for median household being flatlining and for the last 30, 40 years. And I'm pretty sure it depends a lot on measurements. So which actually income metric are you using? How are we going to measure it? What is your starting point? Do you start at the top of the business cycle or the bottom? So a lot of issues relate to that. But give us a little bit of the broad picture. And is the dream still on? Is he alive or not? Or are we actually stagnating?
Yes, it's a great question. And first of all, I agree with your characterization that there's a consensus view out there, which is that for decades, for the last 3 or 4 decades, the U.S. economy has been failing to deliver the types of wage gains that people do and should expect, the types of income gains that households should expect. There's pessimism around the state of the middle class and whether it's still possible to achieve a middle class lifestyle without a college degree. There's pessimism about whether America is still an upwardly mobile society, or is America a society characterized by wage stagnation, and characterized by an inability to kind of climb the ladder where your kids won't do better than you. And I think that the conventional view on this is just empirically wrong. And I think the view is so kind of extreme in the pessimistic direction that you can say that it's just not supported by the data. So that obviously begs the question, why is that? And I think that there are really kind of two big economic explanations for why that's the case. The first is that the U.S. economy entered kind of a regime shift in the early 1990s. And so if you were an economist in the year 1985, or if you were an economist in the year 1995, it would be perfectly reasonable for you to argue that wages had been stagnant for decades, because wages had been stagnant for decades. If you look at the U.S. economy, you see that the economy came out of the Second World War with tight labor markets, a lot of wage growth. But then in the early 1970s, the U.S. economy entered an inflationary regime where price inflation really outpaced nominal wage inflation. That regime stuck around until the early 90s. And in order to reset inflation expectations and to get inflation under control, the U.S. Federal Reserve had to engineer a very severe recession in the 1980s. And so you had this kind of period of time that lasted for decades, where in the 70s you had supply shocks, you had expansionary fiscal policy, that led to large deficits, and you had a regime where inflation was outpacing nominal wage gains. Then you go into the 80s, you still have a lot of this inflation. The Fed engineers a big recession, so now you have inflation getting under control, but really a bad period for workers. Um, but then in the kind of early 90s, inflation expectations are reset. There's a productivity boom in the United States due to the kind of digital revolution, the advent of personal computers and associated technologies. And that trend stopped. And the US economy entered a new regime. And so I think it would have been reasonable in 1995 or even, in 2005 to kind of think of that, okay, well, maybe the 90s were the aberration, right? Maybe the 70s and 80s were normal.
Mhm.
The 90s were this weird period. But it's been uh 3 decades since the early 90s. And if you look back at the behavior of wages, what you see is that wages have increased by over 40% after adjusting for inflation since the early 90s. And if you look at a chart, I think you can kind of see these three regimes in the chart, right? You see, pretty solid wage growth following World War II. You see wages stagnant or declining from the early 70s to the early 90s. And then you see a 3 decade period where wages really have been growing. That hasn't been a period of uninterrupted progress. There have been periods during the last 3 years where wages have not performed well, but on the whole, I think it's a story of growing wages, not of stagnating wages. I said there were two economic explanations for the pessimism. One is that the pessimistic view was empirically correct for a long time. And the second is the 2008 financial crisis. Um, and from 2008 until 2014 or 15, that was a bad period for
Mhm.
most American workers. And I think it's no surprise that during that period, you saw the rise of the Tea Party on the political right, the rise of Occupy Wall Street on the political left, the rise of Donald Trump on the political right, the rise of Bernie Sanders on the political left, and you really saw uh, populism uh, ascend in the United States during that period. That was a bad period. But I think if you zoom out from that, what you see is, again, over the last 3 decades, over 40% growth in inflation adjusted wages, despite the 2008 financial crisis, despite the September 11th terrorist attacks, despite the rise of populism and populist policies in the United States, despite a once in a century pandemic. And it's just really quite remarkable.
And has it been across the entire spectrum of the income distribution, or is it because one of the other kind of criticism, or one of the points that the more pessimistic commentators have is, well, it all kind of accrues to the top and very little to the middle of the kind of lower income household. Has it been spread across? Obviously, can't be equally, but in a good way, or is it being primarily concentrated in one area?
Yeah, so again, I think it's hard to answer that question with a yes or no or one sentence. In the 1990s, we saw unequal growth. We saw a big expansion of income inequality. And that, I think, is primarily due to the nature of technological change during that period where because technology was advancing in such a way that college educated workers were able to be more productive. You saw uh, you saw that the wages of college educated workers were growing faster than the wages of lesser educated workers, and inequality increase as a consequence of that. Since the financial crisis, if you look broadly at inequality. If you compute inequality using the Gini coefficient, and you define income as post-tax and transfer income, what you actually see is that inequality in the United States has stagnated or even declined over the last 15 years or so. If you want to look at wage inequality, uh, you see, I think, pretty clearly that we're in a period of declining wage inequality or shrinking wage inequality. Um, it's a little bit difficult because of the pandemic, but in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, wages at the bottom were growing faster than wages at the top. Pandemic, kind of a weird thing. Let's just set that aside. Let's set 2020 and 2021 aside. In 2022, 2023, you see wages at the bottom growing faster than wages at the top. I think you also see that in 2021, but that was kind of again kind of a weird economy. And so, I think if you look at income inequality, you see stagnant or declining income inequality. If you look at wage inequality, you see I think you see pretty clearly that wage inequality has been shrinking. And so, kind of where does that leave us? Inequality. The U.S. has a much more unequal wage and income distribution than we had in the 1960s. Um, but the period where inequality was growing, I think is behind us, and we're actually in a period where inequality is shrinking. Inequality probably was worse now than it was I'm sorry, worse in the 1920s than it is now. And so I think it's very hard to,
Mhm.
the trying to characterize these trends, I think, is difficult because they don't lend themselves to easy characterization. But
Yeah.
maybe the most straightforward answer is, over the last decade or two, inequality has been declining.
Yeah. No, that's good. Thank you. And is it something related, particularly the increase at the bottom? Is it more of a policy issue? If you're trying to look at the lesson learned for policymaker, is it a policy issue? Is it just the nature of the business cycles, the nature of the economy and technologies, the fact that more recently the wages at the bottom have increased faster? Just to see whether is something that the policymaker got right or they just got lucky.
Yeah, I think the there are two big lessons here for policy. If you want to talk about wage inequality, I think the lesson is that the best thing you can do for low wage workers is have a hot economy with tight labor markets. Um, and if through macroeconomic policy you're able to create a situation where employers are chasing workers rather than workers chasing jobs, then you can't beat that
Mm.
with any kind of microeconomic policy. Um, a hot economy with tight labor markets not only sees a reduction in wage inequality or kind of substantial increases of wages at the bottom of the distribution and throughout the distribution, but you see employment rates increase. You see employment opportunities for traditionally vulnerable workers increase. You see greater opportunities for formerly incarcerated workers, for example, greater opportunities for workers with disabilities. You see upward mobility of continuing workers. Uh, they're able to quit jobs and find jobs that pay better, see their wages grow, kind of climb the occupation distribution. And it's just a really beneficial situation for workers throughout the distribution, including workers at the bottom. Um, the second lesson, maybe more focused on income inequality, is that tax and transfer programs can create economic opportunity for low income households and can reduce inequality. I think I think as a normative matter, the former goal is more important than the latter. I think we should be more concerned about the opportunities available to lower income households than we should be concerned about, the level of the Gini coefficient. But if you're really worried about the Gini coefficient, that's to at least some degree that can be influenced to at least some degree by economic policy.
Okay, no, that's good. And in a sense, I think if you look at the analysis more recent that has been done by kind of Alton and Splinter, they looked at the post-tax and transfer, and actually it works pretty well in terms of reducing the level of inequality, the current system in the United States and other countries. But despite what critics say, the United States actually works quite well. And if you look, you mentioned a little bit about hot economy with time market. So where are we now at the moment? Kind of in June 2024, and the economy actually coming out of obviously the cycle of inflation post-pandemic, kind of with inflation coming down. You had a bit of a pause in the first quarter. Market was still relatively tight, but you see some sign of straining recently. So where are we at the moment in that kind of level of business cycle in the United States, and what should we expect in the next few months?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we are, I think I can describe where we are with two sentences. The first is that we are in a very hot economy, and the second is that we're in an economy that is cooling. And so, and those things can both be true at the same time. We have a 4% unemployment rate, very, very low. We have, kind of a rough balance between the number of unemployed workers and the number of unfilled job vacancies in the economy. We have an economy that's adding 200,000 jobs a month, let's say. We have an economy with demand still outpacing supply, and inflation, underlying inflation is probably in the 2.5 to 3% range, so still considerably above the Fed's 2% target, which again reflects that supply and demand imbalance. This is an economy with strong consumer spending, and an economy where investors are feeling optimistic about earnings, about corporate earnings, as is reflected by the stock market. At the same time, the economy is certainly cooling, and we were in 2022, we were an economy that was adding 600,000 jobs a month. In 2023, we were an economy that was adding 400,000 jobs a month, and we're now in an economy that's adding 200,000 jobs a month. That represents a substantial cooling in the labor market. We've seen the unemployment rate go up by more than 50 basis points off its cycle low, which is a considerable cooling in the labor market. Underlying inflation has come down quite a bit, and consumer spending, the data are still a little bit murky, but consumer spending seems to be slower in 2024 than it was in 2023. And so, that creates a difficult circumstance for the Fed. If you look at the trajectory of consumer spending, if you look at the trajectory of the unemployment rate, or the trajectory of the labor market more broadly, there's reason to be concerned, not just about price inflation, but also about a looming slowdown in the labor market, particularly if you remember that monetary policy operates with a lag. At the same time, there is still a risk that the economy either does not continue to cool and kind of settles with inflation 50 or 100 basis points above the Fed's target, or that the combination of inflation-adjusted wage and income gains that have been in place for 22 months or so, and the wealth effect from big gains in the stock market and housing appreciation, home price appreciation, actually is positioning the economy to reaccelerate, where you would see inflation, not just kind of settle at 2.5 or 3%, but actually start to accelerate. And that's the challenge facing the Fed. Do we, certainly if you kind of zoom out over this tightening cycle, you see that the economy has slowed quite a bit over the past couple of years. Do we think that will continue? If so, should we get ahead of that by reducing the funds rate? Probably not reducing it to the neutral rate, but maintaining a restrictive funds rate, but one with the policy rate below 5 3/8%. Or is there enough reason to be concerned that the slowdown will not continue, that monetary policy should not take a kind of less restrictive stance?
Yeah. So no, that's a good picture and a summary of where we are. So you're talking about the Fed and what it might do, whether to trying to engineer and even further the cooling, or actually the worries about inflation being more important for the reaction function. So what's your expectation now then is it going to be a cut? Is it going to be a lot of the commentators are talking about September. Some people say in December, some are even saying nothing at all this year. What's
Yeah.
your thoughts? Is it a September, December, one cut,
Yeah.
two cuts?
I think the odds of a September cut are around 20%. So considerably less than investors think.
Okay.
The Fed, basically needs to have every inflation report between now and the September meeting be perfect.
Yeah.
They need each inflation report to be better than the previous one, to show a downward trend, to show a sustained downward trend, um, uh, uh, in order to justify a cut in September, I think. Um, and so I think that's possible, certainly.
Yep.
Uh, the odds are not zero, but I think it's much less likely than likely that will happen. Uh, you know, I I I think it's a little bit difficult to say, the December Fed meeting is 5 months of data from now.
Yeah.
Um, I'd put the odds of a December cut, kind of in the 40 to 50% range. Um, I think the Fed would not need every inflation report between now and the December meeting to be perfect, but there would need to be pretty clear evidence
Yeah.
of a sustained downward trend in inflation over that period, or there would need to be a substantial deterioration in the labor market. I think either of those are quite plausible outcomes. Um, my my basic view, um, uh, though, is that the the consumer is going to have a tailwind from cooling inflation, uh, uh, which is causing inflation adjusted wages and incomes, and we are seeing consumer spending really supported
Hmm.
by asset owning households in a way that's somewhat unusual in the United States. And those asset owning households, uh, it's not clear to me what gets them to slow down their spending. And so we could have a situation where uh, there are significant asymmetries in the economy, and maybe lower income non-asset owning households do pull back on their consumption, whereas higher income asset holding households don't. But the vast majority of our consumer spending comes from those higher income households, and so even if lower income households pull back, that's probably not going to be enough to really change the trajectory in a meaningful way of aggregate consumer spending. And so my baseline view is that we will not have a cut in 2024. But I think the odds of no cut are in the kind of 50 to 60% range. And so I can imagine data coming in between now and the end of the year that changed my mind about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's interesting. In a sense, that kind of the impact that asset holding and the income that comes from those assets is another kind of additional data point that might support the reason for the higher for longer, where you actually keep rates higher, because actually if in the spending and the growth is still kind of, that's not justify necessarily a further cut, or at least a cut that brings it down, as you said, to the neutral rate, which might be down a kind of towards the 2 to 3% range, which we might see in the future, but definitely not in the next 12 or 18 months, possibly. And as we pivot a little bit in our last section of our interview to the longer term, we look a little bit about the past, probably not as bad as a lot of people say. The growth has been for the last 30 years in wages across the income distribution. We're still in a kind of still hot but cooling economy, but maybe not as cooling as fast as to warrant a cut in the rates now. As we look forward, you start seeing a lot of different estimates about the impact that the latest kind of technological boom, primarily driven by AI, we've seen in the last few years, and the impact it might have on growth and productivity. Just recently, I was looking at, I believe, a kind of a report by KKR where they upgraded slightly the natural neutral rate for the United States with growth, I think from 1.7 to 2% or something like that, because of some of the technological implications. So, but at the same time, you see a lot of kind of comments and a lot of views around the potential danger of AI, both in terms of the more apocalyptic, in terms of what it might do to humanity, but the more kind of more day-to-days around that kind of the loss in work and opportunities for workers as well. You recently wrote quite a few kind of articles and opinion pieces about a case for AI optimism, and therefore you see actually a positive impact of AI on productivity. Just give it a little bit of a summary of your thoughts around actually AI and productivity going forward and the implication it might have actually for long-term growth.
Yeah, absolutely. I am pretty bullish on this technology. I see, like everybody else, I see the kind of astounding leap forward in natural language processing in 2023, where we saw machines pass the Turing test for the first time, which is a remarkable thing. I think it's reasonable, the critics who say like, okay, great, these large language models can write a economic analysis in the style of a Bob Dylan song, but that analysis is full of errors or whatever. I mean, that's not a crazy view, and it's very reasonable to have some pushback. But I see very clear use cases for this technology. This technology will, I think, have a big impact on healthcare productivity. It will be able to look at medical scans and make diagnoses faster and more accurately in many cases than medical doctors. I think that there are enormous implications for education. This technology will enable every student to have a personal tutor in a sense, and that will lead to productivity gains. Not just like near-term productivity gains in the education sector, but also that should increase the level of skill in the workforce as a whole, as the students who get a better education because of their AI tutor grow up and become workers who are better educated, more skilled workers. So I think this will end up being a big deal. What does big deal mean? I can imagine that this technology ends up, we end up looking back on this technological advancement as, similar to the smartphone, maybe similar to the personal computer. Um, so a big deal. I mean, not a kind of, civilization, you know, changing deal, right? I mean, for those of us who are old enough, life today feels pretty similar to life in the 90s.
Mhm.
Even though in
Yeah,
the
they do. That
90s,
does. Yeah.
yeah, and so it's not like the future will be completely unrecognizable because of AI in the way that a lot of the hype around AI, both
Mm.
good and bad, would have you suggest, right? The people who are afraid of this technology, are kind of painting this picture of, you kind of, widespread mass unemployment, or, total war, or, kind of Skynet takes over, that sort of thing. The optimists, I think, are kind of similarly hyperbolic in the optimistic direction. I think life 20 years from now will feel a lot like life today, but in the same way that the internet, the personal computer, the iPhone have had, really big effects on how we live our day-to-day lives and how businesses are run and how businesses generate revenue and profits. I think this will be kind of up there with those innovations.
Yeah. No, I think it kind of reflects a lot of the attitude from quite a few of the commentators that looked this in a little bit more detail. And that makes it kind of a little bit positive. The question is whether kind of the recent wave of more kind of populistic politician might actually see the benefits in the same way, or might be kind of spurred to do some policy which are a bit more damaging as well. So that's definitely kind of a risk. I think I want to conclude with one final comment, and it's an article actually that I think you published today, which is around kind of the right response to AI about encouraging work
Mm-hmm.
and about the value of work, which I find kind of very, very interesting. And there is a great book by David Banson recently. They're talking about the future of work and the work as value in itself. And so even if you have AI and there's a lot of the work for us, we shouldn't just sit back and do nothing all day. And I do remember, I think that there was articles back in the 1930s where Keynes said it was talking about having a 15 hours week, and obviously it never happened. But your point in the article was actually that doing work is important in itself. And you started the article with your quote, there's nothing that stops a bullet like a job. So it's actually kind of
Yes.
doing work as value in itself. And I don't know, wonder if you want to say a few words around actually what your suggestion are in terms of what will be the policymaker response actually. How do you encourage work and why it is important?
Yeah, well, on that quote, that's not a quote from me. It's a quote from a Jesuit named Gregory Boyle, and Father Boyle was decades ago, I think in the 80s, assigned to be the pastor of the poorest parish in Los Angeles, and there was a lot of gang violence, and he wanted to help, and he tried to get local businesses to hire gang members, and that wasn't successful. And so he started, trying to marshal resources and, paid their salaries himself. So, if you won't, can this person can this gang member just work for you for
Yeah.
free and I'll pay the salary? And then that eventually led to the creation of a company called Homeboy Industries. And that company has, nearly a dozen businesses that are part of it. There's a bakery and an electronics recycling shop, and they make T-shirts and but a bunch of stuff. And Father Boyle's motto for decades was "Nothing stops a bullet like a job." And this came to mind because Father Boyle was just awarded by President Biden the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which in the
Mhm.
United States is the highest civilian honor. And so yes, so this, the occasion of Father Boyle winning that award, led me to kind of reflect on the value of work, and his ministry has been kind of, predicated on this notion that if you want to, rebuild somebody's life, you
Mm.
help get a job. and that'll help them stay, that'll help them stay on the right side of the law and stay out of gangs and be productive members of society. And how does this relate to artificial intelligence? I think a lot of the policy debates that we have um, are people talking past each other because they don't share a common framework, and they just have very different underlying assumptions about the 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 purpose of public policy, the role of government in markets. And we'd have a much better debate, I think, if we were debating those assumptions, because differences about specific policies often arise from those different assumptions.
Mm.
AI is going to be very disruptive, just like the personal computer and the internet were. And we should have uh, policies designed to address that disruption. And my argument is that it would be helpful for those policies to have a North Star, or maybe a couple North Stars. One that I've written about recently is one that you mentioned a few minutes ago, which is, in my view, policymakers should take technological change as exogenous, and then design policies around it. So the wrong thing, I think, is to have the United States Congress kind of micromanaging the content of algorithms, but instead, let the software developers and the technologists come up with the technologies, and then let the lawmakers figure out what laws are needed in the face of those new technological advances. A second North Star is, or should be, in my view, that work is a good thing,
Mm.
and that public policy should encourage work. And so, if there's a lot of disruption and it's harder for folks to get a job, or maybe more accurately, it's harder to get a job that pays a certain wage. One response could be, oh, let's have a universal basic income, or let's have a giant middle class safety net. Let's move to a welfare for all model, and those policy solutions can address material need, the need of households for income, or for food and shelter and that sort of stuff, but they don't involve working. And if you believe that work is central to a flourishing life, if you believe that people really have a need to make contributions, and a lot of people make contributions to their families, which is great, but for a lot of people, they really have a need to make contributions to society as a whole outside of just their family. And the way we do that is in a market economy, is through paid employment. If you believe that work gives a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, that work, kind of, encourages our better angels, then you don't want to do a universal basic income. You don't want a welfare for all model. Instead, you want policies that make work pay, and that encourage work. Now that depending on the kind of scale of disruption from AI, that could lead to pretty radical pro-work policies, where you're giving earning subsidies to people with college degrees, or you're giving earning subsidies to people pretty high up the income distribution, or things of that nature. I mean, I think it kind of remains to be seen. And so this is not in any stretch, in any sense, a call for policy complacency, or laissez-faire, or anything like that. But instead, it's just an argument. Let's figure out what we think a healthy society full of flourishing people looks like, and let's make sure we have a good sense of that before we start debating kind of specific policy recommendations.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. And I do like the idea of having one or two North Stars as well that can guide policy. I think that's a good principle for any policymaker. So, Mike, that's been great actually to spend the last kind of 40 minutes with you. and we covered a lot of topics. And particularly, it's good to finish on a note of optimism, both in terms of what AI might contribute to society, but also actually the value of work, which I think is very important and not well recognized, or not recognized as much as it should be. So let me thank you on behalf of the SPE as well, and I look forward to have you again on this podcast. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for having me on. It was great talking with you.
Thank you.